Welcome to today's edition of The World Today on advancing democracy in challenging times. We are delighted to be partnering with the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy and to welcome our distinguished speakers to the virtual stage today. But first, let me introduce our moderator, Ambassador Henri-Paul Normandin. Ambassador Normandin has engaged in diplomacy and international development for close to 40 years in favor of peace, democratic governance, equity, and sustainability. He served as Ambassador of Canada to Haiti, as well as Ambassador and Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations. He worked for several years in China and also managed portfolios of programs in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. Most recently, he was involved in urban diplomacy for the city of Montreal and is currently a fellow at the International Studies Institute of Montreal. He has degrees from McGill University and the University of Ottawa. Thank you to all of our panelists today, and let me turn it over to Henri-Paul, who will moderate today's conversation and introduce our panelists. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mike, and thank you to the entire team at Perry World House, as well as to the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy. Thank you for the opportunity that we have today for a timely conversation on a subject which is both complex, multifaceted, and of course, important, that of democracy. As we know, democracy is challenged around the world. So what actually is the state of democracy? What are the trends out there? What explains the current situation? In the current context, how can we advance democracy? And finally, how could a summit for democracy, as proposed by President Biden and the new administration, be useful? So those are the issues that we will address in this panel, and we have grouped for you an outstanding panel of people who have a long experience in the field of democracy. They have studied democracy over time. They also have practical experience on the ground in promoting and advocating democracy. So let me introduce them. First of all, we have Professor Larry Diamond. Professor Diamond is a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute and the Hoover Institution at Stanford. He has studied and published extensively on the subject of democracy. Amongst others, he's the founding co-editor of the Journal of Democracy, and he is active with several organizations, including the National Endowment for Democracy. So, Professor Diamond, welcome. We're pleased to have you with us.
Thank you.
We also have Ms. Paige Alexander, who is the CEO of the Carter Center, whose mission it is to prevent and resolve conflicts, enhance freedom and democracy, and improve health around the world. Prior to that, she worked in several US administrations and occupied various senior level positions, including with USAID. She also worked in civil society organizations promoting democracy and is also a member of various human rights organizations. So, Mrs. Alexander, welcome. We're pleased to have you with us.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
And finally, we have Dr. Annika Silva-Leander from the Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, where she heads the Democracy Assessment Unit. And she publishes, and the unit publishes every second year, a Global State of Democracy report, which has also become a reference around the world. And prior to that, Dr. Silva-Leander worked at the World Bank and in various UN institutions on issues of governance, democracy, and social development. Welcome, Dr. Silva-Leander.
Thank you.
So the way this will unfold this afternoon is that we will have the conversation with our panelists for approximately 35 minutes, and then we will look forward to your questions from the public to continue to enrich this conversation. So without further ado, let us jump into the discussion. And as a first segment, before we start digging in the more complex issues, let us take stock. What is the state of democracy around the world, and what are the trends? Dr. Silva-Leander, let me start with you. You published this Global State of Democracy report. What are the findings? What does the data out there tell us about the state of democracy and the trends?
Yes, thank you very much, Ambassador, for this introduction and for the opportunity to share with you all some of the data and our most recent analysis on the state of democracy in the world. What we see is a fairly bleak picture, unfortunately, and I think I'm going to start with highlighting some of the concerning trends that we've seen happen prior to the pandemic and also deepened during the pandemic. There are some positive developments as well that should be highlighted, and I hope I can get to those as well. But for now, what we're seeing is that the concerning trends are really overriding in terms of the developments that we're seeing. Now, what we're seeing, what we saw prior to the outbreak of the pandemic was a concerning trend of democratic deterioration throughout the world. Since 2012, we've seen that the number of democratic and non-democratic countries that experienced democratic declines started to rise sharply from 2012. And since 2015, the number of countries with significant democratic declines now outnumber the number of countries with advances. Until then, until 2015, we had seen a steady increase in the number of countries with democratic advances since the start of the third wave of democratization in 1975. Now we see a break to this trend very clearly in the last couple of years. Now, IDEA classifies countries into three regime types, political regime types. We have a very broad category of democracies, which include everything from minimalist electoral democracies to high-performing mature liberal democracies. On the other side of the spectrum, we have authoritarian regimes that have closed political spaces and very little room for dissent. And we also define an intermediate category that we call hybrid regimes, that do not qualify for the minimum criteria of minimally competitive elections, but that have some space for a critical civil society or a critical media, depending on the context. And what we've seen since 2016 is that more countries are consistently moving away from democracy towards hybridity or authoritarianism than towards democracy. And since 1975, there have not been so many consecutive years in which this trend has been observed. However, we see a similar trend around the 2008-2009 financial crisis, with a similar peak in the number of countries moving away from democracy in 2010 that we saw in 2020. But what we see is that the democratic crisis observed now is more severe than 10 years ago, if considering the number of consecutive years of this trend. Now, the other concerning development that we're seeing is that non-democratic regimes, so the hybrid and the authoritarian regimes, are deepening their autocratization and becoming more repressive. And this is something that we see very clearly in the last 10 years. So since around 2010, the number of non-democratic regimes that have become more repressive have increased by around 40%, further closing the little democratic space that they had. And this now affects more than a third of all non-democratic regimes. And if we look at the countries with the deepest autocratization in non-democratic context, it's countries like Turkey, Nicaragua, Burundi, Venezuela, and Cambodia. Now, we also see the reverse trend. So with fewer countries now than ever moving towards democracy. And when we account for the number of countries moving towards authoritarianism, the net movement of countries moving towards democracy has never been as low as it is now. And it's negative in net terms. And for so many consecutive years since 2016 as well. So until 2016, we saw the average number of countries moving towards democracy per year on average was around 4.4. And of course, this number was much higher around the 1990s after the fall of the Berlin Wall, but it hasn't continued. We have seen an increase in the number of democracies, even though not as sharp in the last couple of years. But
so a rather sobering picture, but you nevertheless see a number of positive trends in there. And of course, we will come back in a few moments to the reasons behind all this. But if you allow me now to turn over to Professor Diamond, you've been studying this and following this for several decades now. What is your take on the state of democracy today?
Yes, well, I think International IDEA and Dr. Silva-Leander have done a great job of depicting, as she said, a very bleak picture. So I would just highlight a few additional points. Of course, the different assessment endeavors, Freedom House, Varieties of Democracy, Economist Intelligence Unit, International IDEA, they don't align perfectly on the details, but they all agree on the broad trend. Freedom House depicts a 15-year continuous trend of more countries declining in freedom than gaining. And I actually think the global democratic recession began around 2006. But the additional points I would make in broad agreement with Dr. Silva-Leander are, first of all, that we are seeing alarmingly deterioration in the quality of democracy in many liberal democracies, most dramatically, I think, in the United States, but also some in Europe. And we now have an instance of having lost democracy as a member state of the European Union, Hungary, which I actually think ceased to be a democracy and not just a liberal state some number of years ago under Viktor Orban. And you've got these other worrisome trends in Poland and elsewhere. And this is supposedly in the core of the world's liberal democracies. The second thing I would add to her, I think, quite valid portrait is that the global wave of deterioration of democracy and descent into what she called hybridity, or a kind of mixed regime, but a fall from the minimum standards of electoral democracy, is sweeping across some pretty big and influential states. I think the Philippines is no longer a democracy. It's a country with 100 million people. She mentioned Turkey, which declined some years ago. There's certainly been a negative trend in Brazil, and we have to worry about India. The Varieties of Democracy project now no longer classifies India as a democracy. I think that's probably too extreme a judgment. But if India continues the descent it's been on of democratic practices and of freedoms under the BJP and Narendra Modi as prime minister, then at some point, we might not agree exactly when, it will cross over into a competitive authoritarian regime, and the percentage of people in the world living in democracy will then decline from a little less than half, I judge about 48% today, to 31%. So I think we're beginning to enter a kind of deeper and more existential period of crisis and testing for democracy.
Thank you. You're right in pointing at overall numbers, but also the importance of some of the big democracies as well, where the quality is declining is significant also. Ms. Alexander, you've followed that both from within the government and also from the vantage point of the civil society. What is your take on this issue?
Well, it would be hard to add to anything that that Larry or Dr. Silva-Leander said. I will, talk about the global decline during the last 10 years has been so steep, and the level of democracy enjoyed by the average global citizen since in 2020 is down to levels last found around 1990 when I first became active in this field. So, electoral autocracies actually remain the most common regime type. And together with closed autocracies, they number 87 states. So, that's 68% of the world's population. So if you're talking about what Dr. Silva-Leander said, over the last 10 years, the number of democratizing countries has dropped almost by half to 16. So that hosts a mere 4% of the global population. So to Larry's point, we're talking really large countries that have such huge populations that are moving away from democracy, and that's worrisome. I think it's important to also say since 2016, the US has also declined in democracy scores, and the level of concern around the US decline and backsliding actually led the Carter Center for the first time in its history, our 38-year history, to engage in activities around the US elections. So when you start to see people getting engaged in places that they previously have not been engaged, and you recognize that it's a lens that everyone needs to look through to look at what's happening around the world. And so I think the previous comments pretty much laid out where we are in that state.
Thank you. So let us now dig a little bit deeper into the conversation. What explains all of this? What are the factors at play? What are the forces at play? Both internal within countries, there are some commonalities, but also in terms of the overall international environment. Larry, can you please shed light on this?
Well, I think that we have to actually begin with the dramatically changed international context. Mm-hmm. And this also helps to kind of locate in temporal fashion the origin of this decline, which I can show with at least the data I have, I think goes back to around 2006. At least I think that's when the democratic expansion of freedom and the number of democracies really began to level off. Mm-hmm. And start to retreat in some significant ways. What happened then? Well, the US invaded Iraq in what was, I think, one of the most calamitous developments for the United States and for freedom in the world of the post-Cold War era, because it contaminated democracy promotion in people's minds with the notion of force, intervention, excessive, overreach by what some called a new imperial power. And of course, it went very badly. And the US began to pull back from democracy promotion. But I think European democracies were kind of affected and even traumatized by it as well. And it's not that we didn't have new movements for democracy like the Arab Spring, but when those were crushed, people began to wonder whether it was possible to continue to build democracy in the world. Then we had the financial crisis. Where did the financial crisis begin? In the United States in 2008, with the collapse of our financial institutions and the corruption and failure of regulation underlying that. And I think we have a long trend here extending over, roughly 15 years, maybe a couple decades, of democracy declining in not only quality in the US. I think you look at the Freedom House data, the decline in democratic quality in the US starts well before 2015. And it has to do with the rising polarization in the United States. And if I may say so, in particular with the transformation of the Republican Party, in a way I don't have time to get into. I don't want to be partisan here. There's blame to go around, but this has become increasingly a political party, as we see now, that I think has become, in some respects, among many of its leaders and representatives, more ambiguous in its commitment to democracy, as you see now with the assault on voting rights in the United States. And with this has gone the rise of China as the next world superpower. So it's now, I'd say, nearly a peer competitor to the United States, and the resurgence of Russia, both militarily and geopolitically, as a force to be reckoned with in many parts of the world. And this is all interacting. First of all, the decline in self-confidence and capacity and energy and in efficacy of the major liberal democracies of the world, the rise of the new or resurgent authoritarian powers of the world. These are interacting with one another. And so you get Putin intervening in Ukraine, and we're not able to do much to reverse it, for example. And then leaders around the world, Orban, Erdogan, Chavez, they sense this weakness. they mobilize these populist agendas, turning the masses against the established parties and institutions, in their view, the good, deserving people against the corrupt elites. And they see they can get away with it with relatively few, if any, real consequences to make their lives and their political ambitions more difficult. And I think, if I may say so, the failure of the European Union to address this backsliding in Hungary has been a seminal event. So you've got all of the frustrations of inadequate economic performance, the crisis of immigration, the backlash against globalization, unfolding and being exploited in this changed international context. That's my brief explanation of what's driving this.
So yeah, thank you. You've outlined a cocktail, if I can put it this way, of international and domestic factors as well. Paige, what is your perspective on this?
Yeah, so I would say, I mean, on top of what Larry said about wars and overreach and financial crisis and rise of superpowers and a global pandemic, I would say the forces at play are really what we see in creeping authoritarianism. It typically follows a very similar pattern. Ruling governments first attack the media and civil society. This then polarizes societies by disrespecting opponents and spreading false information. And then it undermines the formal institutions. We have seen this around the world. So I would say my handful of things that forces, I would say the decline in political space, the polarization and disinformation, which is linked to the digital threats narrative that we see in a lot of these places, the changes in technology and social networks and media and information, that rapid change has really changed the what we have seen as how information is spread and disinformation is spread. Say the lack of global leadership, democratic global leadership. The US was really largely absent during the past administration, and a distracted and divided international community has allowed oppressive regimes to flourish, like Orban and others. The global economic and social inequity or inequality highlighted by COVID, I think this is really something that we are going to be living with for generations now. It revealed and exacerbated all the existing inequalities, both in the US, as we've seen, as well as really remove the lines between what a global pandemic really means between a developed and a developing country. And then you have the cross-cutting issues like climate change, which impacts everything from water scarcity. So I think those are the forces at play, and in my mind's eye, to add to what Larry had added.
Thank you. Annika?
Yeah, it's very difficult to add anything of substance to what's already been said by Larry and Paige. But if there's something to add also in terms of the European perspective, and I think also Latin America is prior to the election of these, many of the governments that have come to power in the last decade, many which were elected after the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, of, if you call populist parties on the left or the right of the political spectrum, or what Vidam calls the liberal parties. I think what provided fertile breeding ground for those parties to be elected into government positions was declining levels of support for democracy in many countries, in established democracies, in Latin America, in Europe, and in other parts of the world. And those declining levels of support for democracy were linked to, to the consequences of the economic crisis of 2008, 2009, and the effects of that economic crisis, increasing inequalities, perceptions, real or perceived, about high levels of corruption, and also frustration about more adversarial political conflicts. All of this undermining the credibility of democratic institutions and democratic processes, and maybe democratic political leaders as well. And this provided really fertile breeding ground for liberal parties that emphasize authoritarian values rather than democratic values. And you see from in the past 10 years, a significant increase in the number of governments with liberal parties in powers. And here we're talking in Europe about Hungary, Larry mentioned already, Poland also not to be discarded, Serbia, not in the European Union, but in the European sphere, and a number of other countries also that have either liberal parties in power or supporting government coalitions in power. And in Latin America, also similar tendencies there, both on the left and on the right of the political spectrum, and in the US, of course. So, and how the different factors sort of converge with political polarization being there to start with, but also being exacerbated by the advent of social media, and how social media sort of continues to deepen already existing tendencies towards polarization in a lot of contexts. So how the factors interplay with each other, I think is also important. I think also I think Larry mentioned it to some extent, the diffusion and the mimicking effect that we see when, and this, there is a significant amount of research on this, that both democratization and autocratization are affected to some extent by a diffusion mechanism. So countries tend to mimic both the anti-democratic behavior as well as the democratic behavior of the neighbors. And in the last couple of years, what we've seen is a mimicking of the anti-democratic behavior. Anti-democratic rhetoric and discourse and behavior and practices have become normalized. And you haven't had the pressure that you had before, with a lot of sort of large democracies retreating from the multilateral scene. The US, I think, being the most important of those players in the global democracy scene that retreated and gave space for this to occur.
So if I may, this leads us actually. So this is a great lead, Annika, into our next question. Actually, all the three of you have outlined a number of challenges, some of the factors and forces that are at play. It's not a very welcoming environment out there. So the next key question is, well, in this context, how can we effectively advance democracy? And I emphasize here the word effectively, because we can always talk about democracy, we can launch a range of initiatives, we can keep busy, but what has impact? Paige, your organization is involved in various democracy promotion programs around the world. Tell us.
Sure. Well, I think the importance of global political leadership by the US and other democracies really can't be underestimated. You know, I'll take the opportunity, since I'm not in this administration, to say I really think policy here is important. You know, the Biden administration really needs to provide clear leadership and articulate its goals and work with partners to advance the democracy agenda and democratic reforms to address the democracy deficits, both at home and abroad. I think it's important for the US to acknowledge its own democratic shortcomings openly and frankly, and recognize it can learn from examples from others. You know, as I said, you know, in 38 years, we've never been active domestically in democracy until this year. So I think groups need to get involved. I think it's also critical to reinforce global norms and institutions of democracy. You know, with all the concerns we might have about large bureaucracies of the UN and regional organizations and transnational networks, you know, they are still effective. I think, you know, to be effective, we need to strengthen democracy in key countries and with targeted and improved tools. You know, I would say we should focus on countries at critical junctures. You know, this has been the recent in a place where there's been recent progress or where democracy is facing new pressures. This is how we at the Carter Center always pick our countries we focus on for election observation work, because that's the point where they're going to tilt one way or another. And I think it's important that we have a focus on that. We need better ways, policies and tools to enable citizens to hold leaders accountable. You know, this is, I'm sure we'll get into this discussion later, you know, supporting participation by civil society in policy and decision making. Everything can't be government to government. It needs to actually involve civil society, because that's an effective way for change. I also mentioned in the digital era, effective participation in democratic governance is going to really require a process that are more transparent and inclusive. the internet is a wide open space, and I'm glad everyone is in it and able to have these conversations. But at the end of the day, we have to put some structure around this, or else we're going to have the continued spread of disinformation.
Thank you. Annika, International IDEA as well is involved in various democracy programs around the world. Tell us, from your point of view, what is the way forward?
Well, it's not an easy answer, but I'm glad that we can have the conversation on solutions, as well as not just discussing the challenges. I think democracy assistance is at a crossroads, really. And in the past decades, a lot of democracy assistance programs around the world have sort of followed standard modalities of intervention. And they, I think, need to be fundamentally rethought in light of the emerging, very new type of challenges that we're seeing in the global democracy arena. The democracy assistance interventions, the standard ones that continue to be implemented, they assume that all democratization processes follow a very similar path. You have a non-democratic context that opens up either through social mobilization or through elite transitions, and then they transition over to democracy, and then you build democracy in that context. But we know from reality that that's not the way democratization processes happen, and that they can take many different kinds of paths after that initial transition. And so I think democracy assistance hasn't really kept up with those realities on the ground very effectively. And so I think that the menu of democratization support strategies need to be expanded to be better adapted to the wide array of democratization paths that countries have taken in practice in the last decades, and also to grapple and address the new issues that we're seeing in terms of technology, the role of social media, new forms of social mobilization, and backsliding in consolidated democracies. And I think that democracy assistance support interventions needs to be much more versatile, much better adapted to different regime and political context and constellations. You can't have the same type of modality of engagement in a new democracy as you have in a hybrid context that got stuck, that never became fully democratic, and that is at high risk also of authoritarian reversal. You can't have the same kind of support strategy in a context of severe ethnic tensions or conflict. So you need a wider array of options and modalities of engagement of support to democracy in those contexts. I think also what we're seeing is the backsliding in consolidated democracies, and that's another beast, in the sense that those countries are middle and high income countries that are not recipients of democracy aid. But democracy is threatened there. So you need different types of interventions in those contexts. And I think there it's not about building democratic institutions. They are there already in many of those contexts, but it's about democratic education, both in schools and civic education, on the value of democracy and the practice of democracy at different levels, rather than building democratic institutions. So adaptation to this new context, I think, is needed. And I think,
So certainly no one size fits all. Larry.
Well, to the excellent points that have been made, I would add the following. First of all, when we at the National Endowment for Democracy surveyed recipients of democracy assistance about a dozen years ago, and asked them to evaluate what we all have been doing in the US and Canada and Europe and so on, we got a very clear message of point A, thank you for your assistance. It really helps. And point B, please make your foreign policy work in concert with your democratic assistance. In the end, you're not doing much good for us if you're giving us grants to build our civil society or political parties, and then you're embracing our dictators and transferring weapons to them and behaving as if the Cold War never ended, or the war on terrorism is just a new manifestation of it. We've got to lean harder on the autocrats of the world and really make it costly for them to be as repressive as they are increasingly becoming. And foreign policy and the harder dimensions of it must work in closer concert with democracy assistance. Secondly, we've got to work in closer concert with one another. And particularly now that China and Russia have become so powerful and aggressive again geopolitically in the world, if we don't coordinate a more resolute response to rising authoritarianism, particularly in the Transatlantic Alliance and the Trans-Pacific Alliance, and now I think there's some promise in this new grouping of the Quad countries, Japan, Australia, the US, and Japan, perhaps a broader alignment of democracies around them. The third thing is we must confront China's increasing bullying in the world and united front tactics to penetrate democracies, developed and emerging democracies, and compromise them through tactics that the former Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull called covert, coercive, and corrupting. This is really putting the struggle for democracy on an unlevel playing field and having extremely pernicious effects. And societies want this pushback. They don't like this kind of arrogant intrusion into their societies and politics for corrupt ends. And finally, I think we need to drive to, with a much more focused set of initiatives, the media end of this problem, which Paige began to address, and I believe Annika has mentioned as well. And this, I mean, both traditional media and the new social media. On traditional media, I highly recommend to everyone a new proposal and kind of think paper, spirited in part by Luminate, one of the arms of the Omidyar network, to create an international fund for public interest media. I'm telling you, the media are just taking an absolute beating from these regimes that are backsliding and moving into hybrid or worse states, and they need sustainable support. And we need to pool our resources and think more boldly about how we can provide that support.
Thank you. And actually, Larry, some of your comments, you addressed one of the questions we had from the audience, which is, should democracy promotion be part of our foreign policy? But before we get to the questions from the public, maybe one last question, and your last few comments lead right into it. This initiative that has been put forward by the new administration for a summit for democracy, from your perspectives, can it be useful, or how could it be useful? And Larry, maybe I'll turn to you because it's just a compliment to what you were saying.
Well, I will just briefly say it can be useful, and since we need greater coordination among democracies and a kind of positive surge forward of renewed determination and self-confidence to defend and advance democracy, I think it's very much needed. But if it's not going to be a waste of time, or worse, counterproductive, we've got to learn the lessons from the community of democracies, which have been meeting in similar fashion since Warsaw in 2000. And if it's just a kind of talk shop with no clear standards and goals, monitorable goals, and means for monitoring through peer review and otherwise, and review by civil societies, it's going to disappoint. And if it brings to the table blatantly undemocratic regimes, as the community of democracies has frequently been doing, it risks being worse than a waste of time, because it risks legitimating those regimes. So, you know, either Hungary has to not be invited, or it has to be invited with a very specific set of pre-commitments to democratic reform. You can't invite all of these fake democracies to the table, Turkey, Hungary, I would even include the Philippines now, but Bangladesh and others, and pretend that what's happening isn't happening. So it's all going to depend on what the standards are, what the goals are, whether it's going to learn some of the positive lessons, for example, of the open government partnership, and I hope it will.
Thank you. Paige?
Yeah, and not too much to add to that. I mean, I think Larry and I are on the same page about this. I think without engagement of the right people, we're going to make mistakes. And I think we've seen the previous summits, the communities of democracy, George W. Bush did side events on civil society at all the large meetings. So did President Obama. There were a lot of civil society to civil society conversations, not just government to government. And I think that, the Lifeline Initiative was a meaningful delivery that made sense at the end of one of these, which helps human rights defenders. But if we don't learn lessons from previous ones, we're bound to fail, and this becomes very much a talk shop. So I think the most important part of this, in my mind's eye, is it can't be a standalone. It has to be sequenced. We have to build up through, COP26 and OGP and other meetings, the UNGA, the G7, all of these things have to be a build up to something. Because if this is a standalone, there's going to be absolutely no ability for us to carry through with what needs to be done. And I think the theme of democracy right now is so important that unless we actually, I wouldn't say cook this, we don't want a pre-cooked meeting where we just have deliverables announced at the end. That never does anyone any good. This needs to be something that matures and sequences over time and involves all the right people. And I especially say civil society, because I think that's where you end up getting the traction.
Diplomats are good at trying to cook things up, but sometimes things go awry. Yeah. Annika, an international perspective on this summit.
Yeah, I think a lot has been said already, but I would agree that it should not be a one-off summit. It has to be the start of a conversation, of a medium-term and long-term process. I think it's really important. Of course, it has to be done in the right way, but I think that it would be a very important symbolic marker of a changing global landscape now that the US is sort of back on the multilateral scene again. So in terms of symbolic value, I think it's very important also to really generate again widespread recognition of the centrality of democratic values and the legitimacy of democratic norms, and to bring countries together around that commitment. I think that would be a very important symbolic marker, but it needs to be done in the right way. And I think the right way is not just a one-off event, but a series of conversations and dialogues, and ideally repeated dialogues that take place on a yearly basis, and maybe in between as well, where we can sort of assess progress and see how things are advancing. And for that, I think it's important to set some goals and some aspirations that this summit and the participants in the summit sort of commit to. Now, who participates? Again, I would agree with Paige that it can't just be governments. It should be a diverse and inclusive crowd of democracy activists, governments, people that are committed to democracy, human rights defenders. And that's why I see this as a series of dialogues rather than just one-off thing, because obviously including all the democratic players around the world in one place at one time is going to be impossible. But if we see it as a series of dialogues and a cross-sectoral dialogues also, I think it would be important. Now, also in terms of which countries are represented there, I think that it's important that the conversation there also is a balanced conversation between the West, the South, the North. And here, I'm hoping that it can be a more balanced conversation, a more humble conversation, since we've had this backsliding and reversals in a lot of the consolidated democracies, that we can also hear the voices of emerging democracies in the South that are democratically innovating and that are advancing. And that's so there's not just the West and the North talking to the South.
Indeed. And at the end of the day, I would not want to be the one who drafts the list of who will be invited, and particularly who will not be invited at this summit. So we've had a very rich conversation so far. We now invite you, in the audience, to continue to enrich that conversation with your questions. So we will now turn over to the questions for the public. We've received several. And I'll go first with the following, which any one of you who has used is invited to address. The question is as follows: do you think democracies have made a good case for their system during the COVID-19 pandemic? Who would like to take that question?
Well, I'll just say the best case we can make for our system is to get a grip on the pandemic, to be effective in combating it. And of course, we were atrocious in that in the United States in the previous administration. And I give the Biden administration credit for turning the corner on that as rapidly as it has. But it takes a society. It can't just be the government ordering up vaccines. People have to pull together, and our political culture is so damaged now and polarized by distrust and non-compliance and contempt for public authority and the collectivity that you see here, and you see it beginning in Germany again now. A lot of willful non-compliance that's allowing the virus to spread again, even as we administer shots. So there's no substitute for the model of good performance. I think that's the single best case we can make.
Thank you. Annika, I think, yeah, go ahead, Paige.
I was just going to add, I think one of the problems with our democracies and the vaccine disparity, if you're looking at where we are now post the vaccine creation, the U.S. has twice the number of 60% of the world's 7 billion doses have been purchased by high-end countries. So that makes up 16% of the population now. So 16% of the population has access to the 7 billion doses, and the rest of the countries don't. I think, I'm thrilled that Gail Smith has just been announced to head some of the COVID vaccine related issues, because that does link another question that was in here, development and democracy. This is an important part. The US actually has to stand up, because as Larry was saying, with Russia, China, they have all been outperforming us and getting vaccines to other countries. We need to step into this space. I think that's an important place that democracies writ large, instead of just buying up all the vaccines, can actually move into a space where we can be helping provide. And that goes a long way towards building democracies as well, I think.
Thank you. And Annika, if I'm not mistaken, I think International IDEA has published a special report on this issue of the links between the COVID and democracy. What is your view on this?
I mean, the pandemic is posing enormous challenges for democracies and non-democracies alike. So I think that all countries are incredibly challenged by this pandemic. And I think what we need to do is to reverse this discourse and the narrative that authoritarian governments are more effective at fighting the pandemic. And I'm hoping that this discourse is slowly reversing by highlighting a number of democracies that have been effective at fighting the pandemic. Now, Europe might not be the best example, and Europe is very challenged right now, but there are a lot of democracies outside of Europe. I'm thinking New Zealand, I'm thinking Taiwan. Even in Europe, there's some countries that have been better than others at fighting the pandemic. I'm thinking Finland, for example. So highlighting those examples of countries that have actually managed to curb the pandemic in democratic ways, still allowing a democratic debate in society, still allowing critical journalism and investigative journalism to look into pandemic handling by governments, allowing full transparency on data on COVID and so on, and as opposed to the authoritarian regimes that haven't done that, including China. So I'm hoping that we can reverse this very damaging narrative that damages the credibility of democracy overall by seeing what's happening now during the pandemic.
Thank you. And now moving to another dimension of this conversation. When we talk about democracy, we tend to focus on the political issues, but democracy is also about delivering for the people and about socioeconomic development. So we have a question here on the issue of inequality. How does vast inequality of opportunity in democracies figure in this conversation? And how should it be addressed? Who would like to take this question?
I can go. I can start. It's not an easy conversation. but I think inequality poses also incredible challenges for democracies and non-democracies alike. But again, I think that the inequality data is more available in democracies, and there's also space for protesting in democracies. So, and that's why I think we've seen prior to the pandemic, but we're also seeing it during the pandemic, a wave of mobilization, social mobilization and protests. And a lot of these protests are asking for better democracy, and part of the demands in many countries in Latin America, in Asia, has been to reduce inequalities. So I think that to reclaim the credibility of democracies really need to be better at fighting inequalities, and that's something that they can't be complacent about. It has become even more obvious during the pandemic that has exacerbated a lot of existing inequalities. So that fight is not won, and democracies as well as non-democracies alike need to be better at fighting inequalities. I don't know if the other ones have other perspectives on this.
I mean, my perspective is that this is an extremely important issue, and that inequality is, I think, clearly and unambiguously driving and facilitating the populist wave, at least in the advanced industrial democracies. And worse, it's doing it perversely, as in the United States, but elsewhere, electing the very people whose policies aggravate the maldistribution of income and wealth, because they mobilize on social issues. And in the United States, you've seen these illiberal populists make significant gains among the white working class. We have got to develop policies that address educational inequities, lack of opportunity. I hate to be partisan here, but I think one of the reasons why Biden's proposed infrastructure bill is so important is that it's going to bring jobs and opportunity, including broadband access to large swaths of the population who are being left out. And in the end, it's about policy. We should also bear in mind how much of the inequality problem is now linked globally in an era where capital can move instantaneously across borders, but labor cannot. And if we don't take a common approach toward, developing policy standards, I think it's going to be hard to get a grip on this. I saw a little teaser on the cable news yesterday that Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen is going to propose a minimum corporate tax rate for the democracies of the world to consider adopting. So companies cannot play one country off another. I mean, that's the kind of coordinated policy that I think might make a difference.
Thank you. Now on to another topic, which has to do, and I will paraphrase the question that we have received here. Do we overestimate the influence that the international community can have on democracy? We're talking here about American influence, but more generally, influence. Do we overestimate the influence that we can have on the course of events and on the course of the development of democracy?
Yes, I'll go ahead and say
Clear answer.
I think the U.S. overestimates our ability to be the world's democracy check. And, I say that having lived in other countries and spent a lot of time in other countries, I think that we are no longer, we have shown, to go to one of the other questions, we have shown that our democracy bends but does not break. So I think January 6th being a prime example of that. But I think we do overestimate our ability to carry the water. It's been interesting over the last 4 years, again, not to get political, but others have stepped up in places that have surprised me, and they've also fallen short in places that have surprised me. Can we jet back in and solve these problems? I think that we carry with us a level of credibility that others don't, but I think the last 4 years have been a real test in democracy worldwide in many respects. And I don't think that I'd like to think that we are the ones that can carry that weight, but I'm no longer sure. So I don't know. I leave that Larry and Annika can answer as well.
I'll go with that.
Annika, also from the point of view of an international organization, what's your take on this? The real influence that we can have.
Well, I think it's important to see the influence not just in terms of the United States. I think, I see a weakened United States coming out of the last 4 years. Now, US is back on the multilateral scene with a clear focus on democracy and its foreign policy. That's good. But I think that the challenges to democracy in the US has weakened the credibility of the US as a democracy promoter. So I think that this calls for the need for the US to build alliances across the Atlantic. And there I'm talking with allies across the Atlantic that support democracy and that value democracy, which is not the case in all EU countries, as we've just said, but also allies in the rest of the world. In Asia, there are, emerging or now almost consolidated democracies in different parts of the world. And I think US needs to reach out to those. And with an alliance, I think the pressure can be greater. But of course, there is a lot of, as we've seen now in Myanmar, that there is a lot of domestic factors that come into play. So international pressure only has some limitations very clearly.
Well, thank you, and thank you to the three of you for this this rich conversation. To all of you out there in the audience, we hope that this this conversation has been useful in shedding some light on some of the challenging issues that we were facing with respect to democracy. We could have spent the entire afternoon, of course, discussing this. So a big thank you to you. Thank you as well to Prairie World House and the team. And I'll send it back to Michael to close the event.
Thank you so much to our panel for sharing those insights and taking the time to join us for this exciting event. And thank you, Henri-Paul, for moderating such a fascinating discussion, and to the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy for partnering with us on this important event. And thanks to the audience for joining us for this edition of The World Today. We hope to see you again later this week, Friday, April 9th, for a very special event, Hard Beats in Soft Power, to discuss music and diplomacy with former Hungarian ambassador to the US, Andrei Simoni, former Deputy Secretary General to NATO, Ambassador Sandy Vershbow, and former New York City climate diplomat, Lolita Jackson, who'll be discussing how music can shape international affairs. We have several other events coming up as well. As always, you can access a recording of this conversation on our YouTube channel. And you can find out about all the great events we have planned for this semester by joining our mailing list and following us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Prairie World House. We'll drop links to those in the chat as well. Thanks everybody to our panelists and moderator once again for being with us today. Have a great day, everybody.